last pharaoh of the 18th dynasty of Egypt tried to erase Akhenaten and his entire family from the history of Egypt. But he failed. The story of Akhenaten's oldest daughter, Meritaten, also known as Scotia or Scota, survived down the centuries in the annals of the Irish and the Scots and in the folklore of Spain down to the present day. And the frantic flight across ancient Europe and her life and death on the far western reaches of Europe is a story that still resonates even today.
Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, folks, wherever you happen to be. I am delighted to be joined by another author called Luke Eastwood, who has written Scotia, the Lost Sister of Tutankhamun. Luke has been a writer for many years, and he might talk to us about a few of his other books. And he started studying Druidism in the mid-1990s, and today he is a practicing Druid teacher and celebrant. His spiritual path has been central to his work, influencing much of his writing, art, and music. Since the late 1980s, he has been actively involved in environmental activism and ecology, and his passion for protecting the earth is reflected not only in his activism, but also in his artistic and literary endeavors. He frequently addresses themes of nature, sustainability, and conservation. So at this point, Luke, I'd like to turn over to you. Maybe you could introduce yourself, anything that I forgot to mention. And you're going to talk to us about Scotia, the Lost Sister of Tutankhamun.
Hey, thank you very much, Kevin, for having me. Well, I think you've done a pretty good introduction, really. Yeah, all those things. I suppose there's not one particular thing that I'm about. I wear different hats and at different times. So, I'm doing a lot of writing in the last few years, but I at some point will take a break from that and go back to doing some more artistic output, I hope, But for the moment, I'm focused on books primarily,
Okay, thanks for that. So let's just start off the interview. I'd like to ask you, what initially sparked your interest in exploring the connections between ancient Egypt and ancient Ireland, and particularly the legend of Scota in Gaelic lore?
Well, her name seems to come up a few times here and there, and there's quite a lot of short articles you find on the internet, and actually loads and loads about her, and a lot of them are referred to the inaccurate pseudo histories, if you like, that talk about Moses and Ramesses II. And I was aware that, from what a couple of people said in passing, that maybe that was all wrong. So I ended up going to have a look at the grave near 𝗃𝗃. I used to work very close to the monument, that was designed by Billy Lean and Elena Danan. And so it was easy enough for me to go up there like after work in the summertime or something or whatever. So, and then I ended up being invited to collaborate on a book called Kerry Folktales with Gary Brannigan, who knew him already, and he was having difficulty finishing the book with too many other commitments going on. So he said, would you help me finish it off? Because he had less than half of it done at that point.
Yeah.
So going through it all, I noticed that he'd done a story on her. And so, that was interesting. He kind of done a potted version of the mythology. And in fact, Elaine Danan, who I mentioned, she illustrated that book, and there's a picture in there that relates to that story. So I thought, well, that's interesting. I'd like to do my own version, which I did in a later book called Dingle Folktales. And then from there, I kind of thought, well, maybe it might make an interesting book. And it was really just an idea. And then I can't remember exactly when it was. So I think it was a little bit after that book came out. I went down there one time in the really heavy, heavy rain, and I noticed these lines on the central stone. Just thought, that's weird. There's like these sort of funny intersecting lines here and there, and oh God, that's wondering what that was all about. But so I took a load of photographs. I thought, God, I must have thought about it more. I think that's a bit odd. Like none of the other stones had anything on them. So I thought, well, maybe at some point we'd check it out and see if it means anything. So that got put aside for a long time. I put the photographs just saved on my computer, and that was the end of it for quite some time. And I don't know, a bunch of synchronicities, really, that it just turned, the subject came up again. There was all this stuff about the DNA from Tutankhamun, etc. There was that's quite a long time ago now, but it's sort of sometimes these stories resurface again.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, actually, maybe I will go ahead and actually do this. But I thought the thing that was really worrying me was doing the Egyptian end of things, because my area of knowledge is mostly around sort of what people, I suppose, for want of a better word, you call it Celtic, which is a term that's banded around that maybe
Yes.
doesn't really mean anything, but it gives you a general idea of sort of,
Yeah.
you know,
I tend to use that word only when speaking about the languages,
hmm,
and because that's what, previous academics have done. But I
hmm,
think it's a bit of a misnomer to talk about Irish and Scottish and even Welsh people as Celts, because that's referring more to like continental Celts, you know what I mean? Whereas
yeah,
I think there's distinct DNA in what I like to call the Gaels or the Scots.
yeah, I'd agree. And then when you look at people talk about Gaul or they talk about Brittany, and even there you think about there's been an immense span of time and a lot of uh, changes. So even with like there's a mentioned in the book, there's a definite DNA link between northern
Yes.
Spain and Ireland, and because of Ireland, also in Scotland, because of the
Yeah.
migration of the Irish into Scotland. But but even though you look, Brittany, you've got a huge mix of people. Even in Ireland, you've got like a whole bunch of waves as described.
Yeah.
Gabala Aaron and various other later books as well.
Yeah.
I think you've 8 sets of invasions overall, and then you've got like uh, after that
You
you've
have
got
the
the Normans.
Norse, the
Well,
Normans,
yeah, the Vikings settled a huge
the
amount.
British.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's interesting. You make a distinction between the Normans and the British, and I would do too. Not everyone would see it that way, but
No.
I think there's a very
Well, I
definite.
even go one step further,
Yeah.
because where this whole attitude of like Brits out,
Mm,
um, F the Brits. like what people don't seem to realize because they don't study their mythology is that um the name Britain, Brythonic, there are basically our cousins, you know, there are ethnic cousins who we have a lot more in common with than the Saxons who came in, the Angles and the Saxons who came in after, and the Romans as well. They like Roman Britain, that was like one wave of migration that they had to suffer. Um, but the Angles and the Saxons came in, and if you check the DNA, right, it's all in that bottom corner where London is, and all of that area in the south of England. And then you see the British bloodline has been pushed up to where they have Hadrian's Wall, and there's the Scots on the other side of Hadrian's Wall. Okay, and
Yeah, and Wales as well, of course, and Cornwall to some extent too. But
yes,
yeah, and people forget actually. I did a video about this about um I called it Ireland's proto empire, I think, and I explained about parts of Wales and Western England were actually colonized and invaded
yes,
by Ireland,
yes.
and Scotland was the one and only really successful colony.
Yeah.
And
Um,
people are like, "Oh my God!" There's like,
I know. It's always kind of funny when you get to that level of like research and you kind
yeah,
of go, "Oh, we were colonizing them first." You know, do you know what I mean? You kind of go, "Oh shit." So yeah, but for those who don't know who Scotia is, maybe you could give us a very like brief introduction. Like, tell me the story of Scotia as if I'm like a school child, you know, and you want to educate me on who Scotia was. Why are the Irish people called Scots? Maybe you can include that. And how did Scotland become Scotland?
okay. Well, that's three different questions in one, but I'll start with the first one. Okay, so Um, I'll do it like a kiddie. Once upon a time, there was this pharaoh, and it called Amenhotep the Fourth, and he had this strange idea, probably maybe coming from his parents, to revolutionize Egyptian religion of the time, which was many gods of polytheism, with like a sort of boss god, if you like, which is Amun Ra, which is really the fusion of two gods, Amun and Ra. So this had been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years. This was the established thing. And Scotia's dad, who was Amenhotep the Fourth, changed his name to Akhenaten. And then he named all his children after the Arten. And he created a special city as a new capital called Akhenaten. And he moved everything down there. And this made him incredibly unpopular with the priesthood, probably with a lot of the public. Because I can imagine it if suddenly overnight, say, I don't know, we're not as religious as we were, but if you go back to say Charlie Hockey's day or something like that, or Albert Reynolds, and they said, right, from tomorrow onwards, we're all going to be Hindus. I'm banning Catholicism. We're Hindus now. Everyone would just be, what? What? You can't do that. You just can't do that. But that's basically what he did. Something equivalent to that, bringing the religion focused around the art, which is like a solar symbol of the creator. He didn't actually worship the sun itself. The sun is symbolic of the creative force of the universe. Um, so anyway, this didn't go down too well. Things started to go horribly wrong for the entire family. A lot of deaths, some of which we don't know what happened exactly, but there's a whole massive array of deaths in the family. And it seems that Meritaten, his oldest daughter, who was very briefly queen, uh, decided to leave. And there's an actual letter written in Akkadian, I think it's in the cuneiform script, that is basically pleading for help. It doesn't actually, it's not signed Meritaten, it's using like a royal, like generic name.
What era are we dealing with here, just to put it into context?
We're talking the middle of the uh, 14th century BCE, so 3,300 and something years ago, more or less.
Yeah, got it.
So, so she left, it seems, and ended up going to, some say via Greece. There's different versions, and then to Spain or directly to Spain. And then she went briefly to Scotland, and that didn't go so well. I think they spent quite a long time in Spain, short time in Scotland, then came down to um, Ireland. It may be possible, or more likely, maybe there's some confusion there. She could have come directly from Spain to the Dingle Peninsula, because the currents actually, if you get in a boat off northern Spain and just drift, you'll probably end up off the coast of Kerry. It's just the currents seem to work that way. So, but then there are strong accounts in Scotland, and then they found these boats off the coast, just north of Hull, I think, three ancient boats from that exact time period, which could be Mycenaean or they could even be Egyptian. They're not 100% sure, but so people have accepted that in the past as a true story, and then when you get into sort of like the Victorian era onwards, you get a sort of rejection of this as just pure mythology, and it's no basis in actual truth. But then obviously you then have a discovery of the city in Amarna, Akhenaten, and then gradually over time an analysis of Akhenaten, his life, like I mentioned that tablet already, and then you've got in more recent decades DNA evidence as well, which is quite interesting, plus some earlier finds such as a burial up at Tara where they found Egyptian beads. So there's a lot of stuff to show that possibly this is really a true story, and she did end up in Ireland, and she died there and is buried outside Tralee, not very far from the 𝗫𝗵𝗵𝗀 mountain range that goes more than halfway across the peninsula. It's just at the foothills of that range. So if that is true, that will make a very interesting story, in that it kind of contradicts sort of the archaeological wisdom that people couldn't really travel those kind of distances at that time. Although I'd say there's so much evidence to contradict that, to prove that people were well able before her time to make long voyages, and the technology had already existed, and it was sort of forgotten in the sort of Bronze Age collapse for a while. That kind of disappeared, and the shipbuilding then moved back forward again to where it had already been. Although that's not
Okay.
a very popular view, but there is a lot of evidence to suggest that.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Okay. And what about how like where does the idea of Scotland come from? Where does the idea
oh
of
yeah,
like the Irish people being Scots come from? Because I know the answer, but I just want to hear
yeah.
from
Well,
how you would
I suppose
explain
you
it.
do. It comes from the word Scoti, which is a Roman name for the people of Ireland who were ravaging the western coast of Britain before the sort of I forget the name of it now. There was a particular event, I think 367 or something, where there was a like multi-pronged attack on Britain, and it led to almost complete collapse. And then that 410 onwards, they abandoned Britain. But from that point onwards, they were having a lot of trouble, and the Scoti were involved in that, as were Angles and Saxons and the Picts up in Scotland. And they got kind of overwhelmed, and that was the beginning of a complete, gradual, but total collapse of Rome and Britain. But before that had even happened, they were already a problem menacing the Romans, and you had already some still in the Roman period, but when they were losing control of bits of Britain, they had settlements in Wales, on the South Wales, I think especially. There was actually an entire kingdom there that was completely run by the Irish, and that's why you get Olmstones, etc., on the Welsh uh, coastlands and stuff. And then, of course, Northern Britain as well, especially Scotland. You've got this huge migration into Scotland, which depending on who you talk to, some people say it's like around 300-400 CE, and others would say that's been going on long before that. But you had a definite kingdom called 𝗺𝗵𝗺𝗀, which was established by the Scoti. And then if you look at the history of the Scottish kings, as they, they took over more and more going eastwards. I don't think they killed all the Picts. I think there was an absorption,
I think so too.
intermarriage of, and
Yeah,
sort of a assimilation of the two groups
yeah,
into
exactly.
a Scottish identity, and then Scotia or Scota or Scotia, whatever you want to call it, is spelt two different ways. It is sort of the great sort of matriarch or progenitor of the Scottish identity. Really, they all harks back to her and the sons of Mill, and the arrival in from these Spanish, essentially Spanish colonists. Although the descriptions given in the Ptolemaic and also the later Irish and Scottish accounts, they didn't actually come from there, from Spain. They settled in Spain, were there for a significant time. Could have come from what was once called Armenia, which reaches up into sort of bits of Russia and
Yeah,
Scythia itself. And then,
yeah,
so it could have been a bunch of different places where these people came from. And then they end up in Spain and eventually end up in Ireland. And then they end up taking over, essentially creating Scotland as a nation state.
yeah. And why do you think the story of Scota has endured in Irish and Scottish traditions despite its distant origins? What is it about the story that has made it so tenacious and lasting in our Irish legends?
Well, I think it might, in a way, be somewhat similar to what's today. In that, if you look at if there's a new discovery about Egypt, people are like, oh my gosh, it's in big news. People love Egypt. It's like, it's obviously an iconic civilization. Uh, and I think even back then it would have been. And if you look at their art and their architecture, their everything about their lifestyle, their clothing, there's something very aesthetically stimulating and pleasing about their whole culture. And I could imagine that other cultures would have been maybe as obsessed with Egypt as people are now back then if they came into, contact with a genuine like sort of aristocrat or a member of the royal family, or even like in this case, the former queen of Egypt. They'd be like probably very struck by it all, and it would be something that you know that you're not going to forget about that. People back in the past were obviously a lot more interested in genealogy, a lot more interested in the sort of deeds of their forefathers and foremothers. And if you've obviously read a lot of the ancient books, it's son of so and so, and who did this, and the names of people, Connor the 100 battles and things like that. People have these epithets attached to their names because of things that they did or that their father or grandfather or whatever may have done, etc. So I would think if you were a descendant of a queen of Egypt, you're not going to forget to pass that information down to your grandchildren, are you? You're going to be very proud of that, probably. So I'd imagine this is just something that's become part of Irish culture that was passed down, that you knew that you were descended from Egyptian royalty if you were in that clan. And then that obviously would have migrated to Scotland as well. The same people when they moved there, they're not going to forget that. And it's if you look at the oral tradition in this country, we don't know how old some of these stories are. Some of them could be dating back, the pagan stories. If you look at the story of I probably say it wrong, 𝗁𝗍𝗺, and then the first man that
Yes, sir.
died,
Yeah,
yeah, that died in Ireland is buried near where I used to live. There's a huge mound outside River Chapel, which is basically supposedly the first person to be buried
Was
here.
that
I
was
forget.
it Bith or Ladra?
I think it's Ladra, but I'm.
Okay,
It
yeah, yeah.
is related
Because
to
Fintan, who was the other man who
Scotia.
traveled with them, they had 16 wives each. I was actually just doing a bit of research on this the
Hmm.
other day. Fintan, he survived the flood in the form of a fish. So I knew it was one of the other two lads, like Bith or Ladra. So yeah.
Yeah. So you've got these stories that go back into like prehistory. I know you've got some of them might even be before the time when the Sumerians were writing, because they have like a they're probably one of the oldest scripts in the world, although there are seemingly undecipherable scripts that could be even older than what the Sumerians used. So, I mean, there's a lot of contention about the subject of home, about how old that is. The official view is very conservative. Um, but, before you had an actual script to write with, people did memorize these stories. I mean, even during my own lifetime, there was a fella, I think in Tralee, that actually he memorized a version of the Tame, and he would go in the pub and speak that. He would tell people, he'd recite his version of the Tame. And here we are. This is the 20th century. I think he might be dead by now, but like this is modern times, and still there is a tradition that people learn poems by heart, they learn stories by heart. The 𝗁𝗵𝗀𝗀, whatever, the storyteller, still that tradition lives, even in the age of social media. So I would have thought if you've got an interesting lineage or an interesting story or the knowledge of this great battle that happened and whenever your clan conquering Ireland, that's going to be carried forward down generation after generation for sure. Sorry, it's a bit of a long-winded answer to that question, isn't it?
No, no, that's fine. You're good. So what broader themes about human history or migration were you hoping to illuminate through your work with Scotia?
Well, I mentioned briefly about the travel. I think that's one of the biggest things that's, I suppose, for me, reinforcing a trend that you're seeing uh, in sort of history and archaeology anyway. I suppose the thing that really opened us all up was the discovery of 𝗁𝗵𝗶𝘀, which changed the timeline about civilization.
Yes.
And then other people have suggested that there's links between the continents. Some of it's like crazy mumbo jumbo. You get into like absolute lunacy. But the basic premise that people could travel by boat much sooner, sorry, much earlier than we think. I mean, even if you look at the Polynesian people, that's credited as possibly 3000 BC onwards that they were migrating across all those islands in the Pacific. So that's very, very early. They're saying they just used rafts at that time. But so even there's sort of an acknowledgement of the possibility. But when you apply that to the Atlantic or other sort of regions, oh no, no, couldn't happen, couldn't happen. But we do now know that, for instance, St. Brendan's voyage was possible, and a guy called Tim Severin,
Yes.
you know about that. He did a replica boat and traveled island hopping up to Iceland, Greenland, and across to Nova Scotia, and down ends up in, the anywhere you want in America after that. Once you've
Yeah.
got that far,
Yeah.
and we know that the Norse, that that's proven fact. But um, and there's some sort of strange anomalous things going back with some of the finds there in the Americas. So I'm not saying that Egypt, the Egyptians went to America, Maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but I'm not going to go there. But the idea of traveling that far is at least a possibility because we know that 𝗺𝗺𝗺𝗀 in it's in 1970. He built two ships. But the first one was a year before, which wasn't very successful because he forgot a key element of the keel that needed to stabilize the boat. So the second boat actually made it all the way from Morocco to Barbados with no problems at all. So to get to Ireland from Spain,
Yeah, it's not that far.
yeah, I mean, come on, like, and the Egyptians actually did develop the first planked boats. So the suggestion, the conventional archaeology is, oh, the Egyptians just sailed up and down the Nile and they potted around the Mediterranean a bit. They weren't really very nautical, and it's all more talk about
Yeah.
the Mycenaeans and the Phoenicians is more,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
that while that may be true, they may not had like the best naval army and naval forces, but they certainly had very early ships and were able to trade.
Yeah.
But the other thing people overlook is, if you want to go somewhere, you don't have to do it all in one go. Just like today, you can, if you're driving a long distance, you stop off at a petrol station and services, and you fill up your car and you get something to eat and go to the toilet and have a rest. You They're kind of assuming that people, you didn't have to go in a straight line from A to B. You can stop off at various points, especially you do the coastal hugging kind of technique. You can go a long way. I mean, they found Norwegian amber in the Middle East going back to, I think it's as early as, I think the earliest finds of trade coming from long distances go back to about 2000 BCE.
Yeah.
So
Hmm. I mean, even the Book of Kells, which was a lot later, it was in the Christian period. So I'm not too sure when the Book of Kells was written, but I would assume it was like in the sixth, seventh, or eighth century. Those 300 years. They have a color in that's made by lapis lazuli, and the only place you could get lapis lazuli was from a mine in Arabia, which was thousands of miles away. And that's the only place you can get it in the world, which
wow.
suggests that they had a lot more sophisticated channels for trade and everything else that goes with that, than we are led to believe if you didn't do the research.
Mm. Yeah, well, there's a lot of ignorance about this. If you look at China, that's somewhere that's been very much marginalized in history. They had sophisticated ships, they had massive trade networks, particularly
Yeah,
across Asia and
Silk
into
Road.
Eastern Africa. I mean, they actually invented the wheelbarrow, which we all use today, but they came up with that invention and lots of many other things which are conveniently just ignored. And so I think there's very much sort of a narrow focus in a lot of history, a lot of archaeology. And when
Yeah.
you start to challenge that, you're usually just ridiculed. And
Hmm.
I mean, if you look at going back to 𝗁𝗵𝗀𝗀, there was a lot of resistance. I watched an interview with one of Professor Smith's uh, sort of assistants. He's obviously dead now, the Professor Smith, but um, there's a younger person talking about what happened and bringing some finds from there and trying to get more interest in looking at this, things like T pillars and whatever. No one was really interested in him doing that work, and eventually he did manage to go ahead. And then it took a long time from the late 80s into the beginnings of 90s that this was all being undergone, and then they had something really special. But I don't think I would have heard anything about that place at all till around maybe 2015, perhaps.
Yeah.
It was not on the radar even for most people
Hmm.
for so long. And yet this was like such an amazing find. I've actually
Yeah,
been here and 𝗵𝗵𝗶𝘀 too, and it's quite astounding. This was not the work of savages.
exactly, exactly. So I'd like to go on to the next question now, and what I want to ask you is, how did you first come across the idea that Egyptians might have traveled to these islands, and what was your aha moment in connecting the story of Scotia to the sister of Akhenaten, Meritaten?
Well, I think I'd been aware of these ideas. I suppose the first time I come across any suggestion of sort of connection between different cultures in the ancient past was probably Eric von Daniken. I read Chariot of the Gods when I
Yeah,
was,
I've read that too.
yeah. I mean, obviously, a lot of it's conjecture. There's a lot of speculation, and I'm reluctant to go there too much with all this stuff. Like,
And
you know,
just for the listeners who
little
might not
green
know
men
who
came down and built the pyramid,
exactly, yeah.
all that kind of thing. I don't want to.
I
The
don't want to
mystery
accept
there,
that because it makes humans seem that we're incompetent and we need outside help. But why can't humans be fantastic at building things as well? So I was always a bit skeptical of like aliens, as the answer because it's kind of lazy, that kind of way.
it is, yeah. And I think that certainly first triggered my thoughts about this being a possible thing, even though I was like certain. I think it's good to be skeptical. You need to have this healthy skepticism, otherwise you believe any old rubbish. Like, but um later on, when this came up, and I thought, well, I wonder, I wonder if there is any real definite evidence. And I thought, well, that could make an interesting book. And I thought, well, if I come across a point where find something that shows this is all a load of old baloney, then I'd just give up because obviously it's pointless writing a book to try and suggest that Scotia was real if I found a lot of evidence to suggest that she wasn't, and it's all a load of trash. But that's not what happened. In fact, the more I dug and the more I researched, the more I found evidence that would fit, like dovetail almost perfectly with this sort of timeline and suggestions. Obviously, not all of the stuff I found in relation to Egypt in um, is perfectly in line with that. I think the evidence in Spain is definitely goes to 1000 BCE, which is still 300 odd years short, but that's getting pretty close. And then certainly the time period you're looking at, say, I mentioned Tara, the body found there of the prince with the fiance beads, that actually does exactly correspond with the right time period.
Right.
And it's almost an exact match for the beads that
Yeah.
Tutankhamun
So can,
himself
can
was
you
buried with.
can you tell us a little bit more about that? Just because you're ringing a bell in my mind, but I can't remember exactly what they discovered. And I'm sure people are listening who don't know what you're talking about as well. So
It was the 50s that they exhumed a body from Tara. I forget which particular part it was. Um, but anyway, so they carbon dated it and it's the right time period. And they don't know. I don't think
they
they've done
did they
any digging.
find jewelry there that was like
Yeah, yeah,
Egyptian?
the
Yeah,
beads, the
okay.
blue fiance
Exactly. Yeah,
beads.
yeah,
And there was a collar, which is sort of Egyptian sort of style.
yeah,
So some people might suggest this person was an actual Egyptian. Others might say it's somebody who actually could have been, interacting with the Egyptian. Who's to say, really? I mean, it's
yeah.
possible that if you were very rich, you would have just buy these beads, for a huge amount of money. Just like super rich people might have, like, a Lamborghini, or they've got like a gold toilet or whatever. Well, people like to have expensive, fancy things if they're powerful and rich. And I'm very much the same back then. If you look at burials of before that and right through to more modern times, certainly throughout the pagan eras, um, people would be buried with impressive artifacts. You even have a tradition now where somebody who's died today would be buried in their best outfit and
Yeah,
maybe with a bit of jewelry on. So, you don't bury them in a sack, you put them in their best suit or their best dress.
exactly. Yeah.
And that's sort of a hangover from those times when people would have been buried with their finest accoutrement and often offerings as well and stuff for the afterlife. I mean, particularly the Egyptians were very fond
Hmm.
of that. Whereas Irish tradition, that wouldn't be a thing. You wouldn't have like a whole bunch of funerary equipment to prepare you for the next life.
Yeah.
That's very much an Egyptian thing. But you've seen a definite possibility of the connection there, where you've got these artifacts. There was another thing found in Cornwall, which was also very ancient, which was coming from Egyptian. Um,
Yeah.
and also, I think off one of the, what are those islands called? Near Guernsey and Jersey. I forget what they called
Channel
it.
Islands.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think there was something interesting found there too.
And what was the aha moment when you were researching Scotia and then you clicked that this could potentially be the daughter, or sorry, the sister of Tutankhamun? Was there something in your research that kind of made that connection for you?
Well, there's a couple of people had mentioned Meritaten, and there had been a few articles I read online that mentioned her. So I suppose what was really key to all this was a book by Cyril Eldred called Akhenaten, King of Egypt. And that was published in, I think was it in the 70s or the 80s? I forget exactly, but it's like the seminal work on this subject, really. I mean, a lot of the groundwork had been done previously in the previous century with the
Yeah.
discovery of the city. But bearing in mind, he was erased pretty much by 𝗵𝗵𝗆, the final pharaoh of the dynasty, as much as could be done. That city was lost, it was buried, and the Egyptians forgot it even existed.
Hmm.
And it was only just discovered by, I think, a bunch of shepherds or something. They found a load of things. And I think they first found the tombs sort of to the if you're like facing north, which would be up towards the main centers like Memphis and Heliopolis, you'd
Hmm.
be on the right hand side of the river, and then beyond that city is a bunch of hills where they got all the stone to build the city from. In there, you've got a whole load of tombs, and these were discovered. And then I think because of that, they then excavated more and found all the remains of the city, um,
Yeah.
which um, led to this whole discovery of of who these people were. The name Tutankhamun was known, but there was a lot of um, I suppose misunderstanding about who he was, because he was removed from the king's list along with his father in many versions of it. And certainly uh, you've got this whole period really from Akhenaten onwards where they just wanted to erase the family. And I suppose there must have been maybe a sense of embarrassment or anger or regard for this as all heresy, because they re-established that. So when you look at these things and you think Meritaten, I got that name, and then I thought, well, I better go and see who she is. And then really that book is like, I suppose, to a large extent, the underpinning of all the work I did about Egypt. There were a few other people. Lorraine Evans has done some important work on that too. Um, that's all about 25 years ago now, I think that book is. But anyway, so I had a knowledge of the Irish texts already, and I I bought I got copies of the Scottish text because I could only find fragments of them online. John of Fordham and Walter Bauer, Fordham, sorry, are the two main sources there. And so you can see where the actual Egyptian origins would tie in with those sort of mythological or sort of pseudo history stories. I don't really know if you should really call them pseudo histories as such, because I think there is an element of truth there, even though it's probably horribly corrupted by the passage of time, and you know there may be some elaborations, um,
Embellishments.
embellishments, yeah, because um, people are prone to do that. It's a bit like the game Chinese Whispers, isn't it? The more people that
Yeah,
write about a story, you get further away from it. If it's not transferred
yeah.
as verbatim oral history,
And
people put their
there's a
own
human
take on it.
tendency to exaggerate and to make the stories more entertaining, which is where uh, these embellished, let's say, alternative facts get imputed into the story. And then that gets told to another person, and that gets told to another person, and so on and so forth, until it becomes
Yeah.
like what we call legend or lore of Ireland. So I completely get what you're saying, and I was always a bit skeptical of the oral tradition, just because how would you prevent those sorts of things from happening when it's very much human nature to embellish the story. And it's like when you go fishing and you say, oh, you should have seen the one that got away, it was this big, and you're exaggerating how big the fish was. So I can see that in like my normal life. So I'm a bit like, how sincere would they have been back then when they didn't have anybody to check? There was no way to verify what they were saying, unless there was some archaeological evidence, unless there was some like tomb or this artifacts that were associated to the person in question.
Well, there
So
are some early records from the you've got obviously a big gap, but then you get to the Ptolemaic period and you have I think it's Mantio writing about this. And he's somewhat distorted there because they've forgotten about this dynasty. So, the last bit of the dynasty. So that ends up tied to Ramesses II, which is out by about probably 70 to 90 years. But so these later stories are perhaps in some part, certainly the Scottish versions, derived from the Ptolemaic history. But then they didn't have access to um, any of the Egyptian stuff that was um, written in hieroglyphs.
mm,
And of
yeah,
course, the whole of the city was all long buried by this point. And well, they only found Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922,
it
was it?
was recently enough. It was in the last, well, previous century. So
Akhenaten was only found like a couple of decades ago, I think.
yeah,
Yeah. And they've obviously done the DNA testing. And what I would really love would be that someone from one of the universities will go down there and do an official, sanctioned dig
yeah,
and actually see if there's a body there, you know. And if
yeah.
there's a body there, that's what all they have to do is do a quick DNA test, and
Yeah, but
you'll
I think that
very quick.
there's vested interests in the world that don't want that information to come out. So like they probably know exactly. When I say they, I mean like why is there a pyramid on the dollar bill, right? Why is this like Egyptian culture permeating into modern culture? And I would suspect that there's some high ranking Freemasons out there who completely know what Egypt is about, and they don't want that information to leak,
You could be right.
because it would completely change the narrative and how we see ourselves. So I wanted to ask you this earlier, but we kind of got onto a different topic. Did you see the recent discoveries in Egypt where the middle pyramid in
Hmm.
Giza, and they did a LiDAR scan, and it looks like they're obelisks, really, because there's definitely a structure that goes down all the like quite a good bit down into the ground, and it looks as though there's a spiral going around this. So I'm just wondering, like, we're told that these were tombs for the kings and the queens, but I'm wondering, is there another purpose for the pyramids? Is there, a secretive purpose for the pyramid? And the thing I wanted to ask about as well is the location of the pyramids in Giza, they seem to align with the Orion's belt almost perfectly. So I think there's more to Egypt than they're letting us know. And I think that's on purpose because, oh, that's another thing I wanted to mention because you said 𝗵𝗵𝗀𝗃 earlier, right? 𝗵𝗵𝗃 is owned by the World Economic Forum. And they've said that we're not going to do excavations on it because we want to leave that for future we want to leave that for future generations.
Yeah,
What
I
do
was
they
shocked by
know?
that news.
What do
Yeah.
they know about 𝗵𝗵𝗃, about Egypt, that they don't want to get out? Because if it gets out, like if this story is true about what's under the pyramid, it's going to completely change the narrative of human history.
Yeah, well, I want to rewind a little bit when you said about, the connection with possibly with, I suppose, the usual connection people think of as Freemasons. And then there actually are two pyramids in Ireland. There's one in Mayo and another one in Arklow. And I think they're from the 1700s. And I think the Howard family, I think they were actually connected with Freemasonry.
Yeah, I think you're right.
There is I don't know if you've ever been to it, just outside Arklow, Kilbride Cemetery. You've got a big pyramid, and then in the bank underneath it, you've got an Egyptian style mausoleum underneath it.
Yeah.
I've been to see it several times, and I remember when I first discovered it, it was purely by accident. I think the NCT center's up there, or was, and I went for a walk because and I just walked and walked past this mushroom farm, and I looked up and my God, there's a flipping pyramid here. I was like, what? I'll have to come back here after once I had to go off and get my car, obviously, and but I came back again and I was like, had a very good look at it all. I was like really shocked. So you've certainly a sort of post-Renaissance massive interest in Egypt. I suppose the whole Egyptology thing was already taken off then.
Yeah.
Very much amateurish to start with, and then it became a lot more official. But there's a lot of stuff from that time period, some of which has just been sort of buried as such, where it's not talked about because it's controversial and it doesn't really reinforce the official narrative.
Exactly.
And going on to what you said about the pyramids, the recent thing, that sort of LiDAR radar thing, or I think it's interesting, but I think we shouldn't get too excited just yet because what these sort of like models they've made, these sort of whatever computer generated things, really are just 100% speculation, in my opinion. There is something there. Obviously, it looks like there are some kind of columns of some kind underneath. But if you look at the actual images on their own, without the actual sort of projected artistic impressions, it's really impossible to say what you're looking at. It's anomalous. It's something strange. There's something underneath there for sure.
Yeah. But even that should be groundbreaking in itself. It doesn't matter what they actually look like. The fact that they go down and it's not just what you see on the top, but there's actually something underneath it. And it was also in Egypt. I don't know, was it in the Valley of the Kings or whatever, but they did a similar approach where they scanned the ground, and it looks like there's underground tunnels. There's an underground basically city, and I'm wondering, could that have been the city that was destroyed or lost, that you mentioned earlier? Now it may not be, but the fact that there's something there is very intriguing. And if I was like, if I was, how can I say this? If I was an Egyptologist, or I was, in charge, let's say like king for a day sort of thing, I would be directing all of the resources into investigating what is in Egypt as well as what is in Ireland, because we have a lot of stuff here in Ireland that we're not allowed to investigate. For example, it's illegal to own a metal detector with an intention to find historical objects. And that's why recently the National Museum of Ireland, they got two axe heads sent to them anonymously. This was just in the last month or so, because the guy was out with his metal detector and he doesn't want to say, I found these historical objects, because there's potentially penalties attached to that. So that's just very interesting. It's like, what do they know about Irish history? And I'm going to suggest to you that this is the reason they don't want us to investigate, is because we might find evidence that connects us to ancient Egypt in a way that is irrefutable.
Well, going back to the beginning of what you said, that city I talked about, Akhenaten, is a long way away from the Valley of the Kings. So there may be another forgotten place. I'm sure there's more than one forgotten place in Egypt that's yet to be discovered.
It
But
may not be at the Valley of the Kings, but that's just what popped into my head. But I remember seeing a documentary where they brought in technology and they scanned the ground, because it was written that there was a city that was here, but it wasn't there anymore. Yeah.
Yeah. And then going on forward to the second part of what you were saying, oh gosh, I've lost my train of thought now. You were saying about
The metal detectors
oh
and
yeah. I
yeah.
think there's a reason for that, right? There's a history, if you look at it, there's a history of treasure hunting in Ireland. And I suppose what they don't want is a bunch of amateurs going around digging up every ancient site, going around the metal detector, hoping they're going to find a lump of gold or some ancient, you know, tiara made out of solid gold from like 3,000 years ago or something. And there are obviously recordings of treasures being buried. People who had a lot of money or whatever, a lot of gold or artifacts or whatever, and it's buried somewhere, hidden, maybe because of a war, could have been during from the times that the British colonization going right back, probably even like during the Viking times. They go, quick, bury all this loot down here, we'll get it later. And then they got killed by the Vikings and they never came back for it. Or
Exactly. Yeah.
further back, the 𝗺𝗺𝗺 were like, let's hide all this stuff because the Malaysians are going to nick all our stuff. So there could be these little treasure troves all over.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, right, I understand in a way why they've done it, because if people think they could just go around with a metal detector and dig up every place, they're going to wreck all of the ancient sites of this country. So that has to be prevented, obviously. And you can't have just
Yeah.
amateurs crazily digging up everything in search of like a gold hoard or something.
Well, I agree with you to a point, but I think what you're going to have there is like people will still go out with their metal detectors secretly, like this guy with the axe heads, and
Mm.
they're going to find an artifact, but they won't be public about it because they'll keep it to themselves, and that's the like negative externality of
Yeah. Oh,
making
yeah.
it legal. But what I would say as well is if the government was also investing money into excavating all of these sites, well, then we wouldn't have to do it. I don't have a metal detector,
Yeah. Yeah.
but
I know what you mean.
it wouldn't fall to like the amateur historians to go and check themselves. So there's a passage grave down here, and I'm in 𝗵𝗵𝗀𝗀, and there's a passage grave, and if you were in the field, you wouldn't even see it because it's only the top. And 𝗵𝗀 is up the road here as well, which has
Yeah.
been
Well,
excavated.
I'll tell you something funny about 𝗵𝗀. When I went there the last day, I think it was, um, I noticed there's a second tumulus next to it, and I was going to get into it, and then I thought, oh, this might fall down on my head and kill me, and I'll be buried up to my oxters in mud, and no one will be able to pull me out because I was on my own, I think, and like there's someone come along, find these two legs, feet sticking out the ground, and I'm dead.
Yeah.
So I was too frightened to go into it because it's not been excavated. It's actually, God, it must probably about, I'm trying to think what the distance would be. It's probably only about 30, maybe 30 meters from the other one, the one that
Okay.
one knows. But if you got in the field next to it, there's another one. It's just more or
Really?
less the same dimensions,
That's
and it's in a
interesting.
lot. It's in this aligned in more or less the same direction.
Yeah.
And I'm just so why the hell did they not do that one? They just left that one.
Well, this is my point.
Touch,
It's like if the
but
government
who
if the
knows
government
what's in
was
there?
if the
It could be.
government is interested in, excavating, preserving
Mm.
professionally these sites, well then they'd be well looked after. You know what I mean? There's a lot
Yeah.
of
But
interest
it's a lot
in
to do with
Irish
money.
heritage.
No, I think
Uh,
money comes into it because they want access. They want a nice big car park. You want a
yeah,
tea room and a interpretive center, and
yeah,
then you
exactly, exactly.
capitalize on it and make a big
Yeah,
bucket load of money out of it, like they've done with the Cliffs of Moher. I remember that before they built the Teletubby house there, you know.
yeah,
Um, but and it was amazing. It was so wild. But obviously, that's just a natural phenomenon. It's not an ancient site, but the same principle of taking somewhere and exploiting it financially to make tourist revenue.
yeah. You're
In
probably right. You're probably right.
we're kind of lucky in some respects that places like Loughrea is too difficult to go and just
Build
plonk
something. Yeah,
in Purpose Centre and a big cafe right there. You have to the place where you goes down the road a few miles. Um, so they don't get touched. They're ignored because they've no commercial value. But at the same time, you could say it's sort of base protecting them to some extent, even though the work's not getting done and the archaeology isn't done, because obviously there is a big problem with funding, and you consider like how much money this country is generating and where does that money go to? I'm getting more into politics and
yeah. I
economics.
know.
Things like arts and history, archaeology, all these things are loaded. You know, if you go into any kind of pub, you're going to see like it's a tourist pub, the big poster of George Bernard Shaw, and there's going to be like
Yeah,
Yeats, and there's going to be, well, you know, et cetera, et cetera.
James Joyce. Yeah,
But now in this time period, where is the support for the arts for people that want to do uh, creative or historical or archaeological work? Where are they
yeah.
getting the funding from? You know, I think they're much more interested in supporting sort of commercial ventures than they are in anything that's of artistic or
Hmm.
cultural value. And they just talk about, oh yes, wasn't James Joyce amazing? But they're not going to support the James Joyce of this era.
No, exactly. I know I know your point. I can see your point. I think I think um I think we should change the subject because I can
All
feel that
right.
we're getting onto politics a little bit too much.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah,
That's all I wanted to say there. I didn't want to say any more than that. I'm
no,
not
no, no, and I don't want to
criticize
say any
any
more either.
particular individuals or anything
That's
like
why
that.
we should change the topic.
Let's move on then to the next one.
Yeah, no problem. So what audience did you have in mind when you were writing Scotia? Like, was there a particular person who was your ideal reader, and how do you make it accessible to them while grounding it in history and science?
Well, that's the thing. I spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I thought, right, do I want to make this an academic book? Do I want to make it sort of like a sort of real niche book, that's aimed at, say, a pagan audience? Or I thought, well, no, this is a subject that's got worldwide appeal. And I thought, right, I need to tell the story in as you say, an accessible way that I thought, right, I need to quote the historical facts. And I actually decided to put a lot of actual extracts from the source material in because an annoyance to me is you're reading the blah 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 and it says, oh, X and Y book says in the book of Leinster it says blah 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 blah, and then they never give you an actual extract, not even like a two lines half the time from the source material. I mean, I know from my own experience how hard it is to buy all this stuff, how expensive some of it is, and I've been lucky. I've got some cheap reprint editions of like 18th 19th early 18th 19th century, early 20th century out of copyright stuff, which you can now buy But like back in like the 90s when I first started buying books and things, you looked at, I remember I actually got a copy of the Tutankhamun in 5 volumes, secondhand mostly. Yeah, they're
Oh,
all second.
wow.
But that cost of, how I looked at buying the full set brand new, I was like, oh, bloody hell, it's like €300. And I'm like, oh my God, I
Yeah.
can't justify that kind of expense.
Who's
So,
the author of that? Is it Whitley Stokes or Gwyn
and
Edwards?
I think that's Gwyn, actually. I think, yeah,
Yeah,
just,
okay.
but anyway, it struck me that people want to read the source material, but no one bothers to put it in. So I thought I'd put as much as I can into the book
Yeah,
so they can actually read the section, read the story for themselves as much as possible,
yeah,
rather than taking my rewrite of it all. So at one point, I'm telling the chronological story of what happened to Meritaten starting with like Akhenaten's of origins, going right through, and you end up the end of the book in Ireland. But all through that, I've interspersed it with source material as much as I can.
okay.
So I'm trying to make it accessible, so it reads sort of like a detective story, if you like, but with the actual uh, an array of evidence, if you like, interspersed all through it to back up my story. And I haven't said it's definitively true. I've got the absolute definitive answer and I'm right. I'm basically saying that this is a theory that seems to hold quite well, but it needs to be proven by the
Yeah.
ultimate
Hmm.
proof is in the pudding would be that excavation if it ever happened. And if it did, it could prove me completely wrong or could prove that I'm completely right. And
Yeah.
until that happens, you know, it is a theory that I'm presenting, but I try to tell the story in a way that you don't have to be an academic to understand it, but,
Yeah.
but at the same time giving you the actual
Source material.
information
Yeah.
at the same time.
And how did specific events during the Amarna period, which is what would you say, 1350 BCE to around 1290
Mm.
BCE? How did specific events in that? You said it was political upheaval, there was religious reforms, there was the erasure of records. How did that influence Meritaten's life and possibly drive her to leave Egypt?
Well, there's not a massive amount available about her. We know that she was the oldest and that she became quite important. She was involved in the cult of the Orton, even as a child. And then later, when her mother Nefertiti died, she was elevated to the great royal wife status. And she was certainly involved in Artanism quite extensively. But then, the other wife, Kia, who's Tutankhamun's mother, she and could possibly even be the mother of 𝗁𝗵𝗀. We don't really know for sure. Anyway, she married 𝗁𝗵𝗀. He became pharaoh for a very brief time and died as well. So her younger sister, also Meketaten, died. Um, there was a lot of deaths. Yeah, the granny died as well. Obviously, she was older anyway, but so I think probably what happened with there would have been a lot of anger over what Akhenaten had done. He seemed to have neglected foreign affairs largely. You've got a lot of the sort of outposts of Egyptian influence, sort of like client kings and whatever, complaining. And then I think I'm trying to think it was a Hittite or was it Mitanni? I think maybe Mitanni ruler complaining about the shoddy gifts that were sent back. So reciprocal gift giving was an important thing. So if I gave you a golden spoon and you gave me back a plastic spoon in return, I'd be like, what the hell's this? Oh, this isn't
Okay.
very acceptable, you know.
Mhm.
So as part of alliances and all this stuff, you should give like back something valuable or something that's sort of honoring your alliance or whatever relationship you have there. the giving of appropriate gifts was important. He neglected all that. When people like were saying, "Hey, we've got a problem with this bunch of enemies is trying, they're amassing at the border and they're obviously gonna attack us soon." He's just like, "Oh yeah, yeah. Well, I'm busy with the art, and so to be honest, I'm just gonna carry on doing this, and you can fend for yourself." That kind of thing was going on.
Yeah.
And I think there's probably a gradual decay in what was previously a very stable Egyptian empire. And then what you happened at the end of 𝗵𝗵𝗶𝘀 and then into Ramesses I, a stabilization of the empire and a re-establishment of order and a sort of revival. Because under the sort of this period in Amarna and during Tutankhamun's reign, and 𝗁𝗍 II, it was things weren't going very well as a sort of international empire. They really were having a bit of a bad time economically, etc. So you could see lots of reasons to clear off. If assuming you're like an insightful, intelligent person, you can see, say, your country is in a really terrible situation. You go, right, I'm going to try and get out of here and move somewhere better where I can have
Okay.
a better
Yeah.
life. And that's like, you wouldn't even have to be that smart. Just sort of, if you had any opportunity to ask for help, and then you probably might do. I mean, there'd be lots of people in lots of situations in countries where they've got no hope of getting away from problems, so they just have to put up with it. But if you're wealthy, if you're royal, if you're connected, I mean, there's an interesting story about Marie Antoinette, who was supposed to be rescued and brought to Dingle. The house was set up for her by, I forget, Rice was the surname of the family. He actually was a friend of her brother, who was like sort of Holy Roman Emperor or something like that. Anyway, so he was going to rescue her. She didn't leave. She refused to leave her kids. But, there was a plan to rescue her from France because she was rich and important and a royal person. And ultimately that didn't happen. So you could say there's possibly a sort of an echo of what happened there in
Yeah.
Meritaten's time.
Hmm.
She was rich and powerful and royal, and she asked to be rescued, and someone came and
Yeah.
helped her escape, sent a fleet of ships or whatever, even
Yeah.
just a couple of ships, even.
You said at the start of your answer that there wasn't a lot written about Meritaten. So how much of
There's
her
a fair bit, but then it just tails off when she just disappears from.
yeah. So how much of her character was based on historical evidence versus speculation? And what clues were there to help you shape her character as a traveler?
Well, that all comes from Egypt, really. Strangely, the stories really don't say a whole lot about her character or who she was. She is almost like a minor character in her own story, in that a lot of it's about the deeds of the people and her husband, 𝗵𝗵𝗺𝗀𝗺, and so their children and what the passage to Spain and the bad time they had there, and then leaving and then coming in, all these battles which are part of the whole conflict between the Malaysians and the 𝗃𝗏𝗏𝗏. And she sort of died at an early point in this war. So which is rather unfortunate. But so if you look through the Scottish and Irish stories, it doesn't say a whole lot about who she was and what she did and what she was about. You really don't get any sense of her character from
Okay.
the Scottish and Irish texts. You get the story of what happened to them, but within that, it's quite shocking even how little is actually about her herself.
Okay.
You know that she was Egyptian, that she was the Pharaoh's daughter or a queen of Egypt. Some of the, in some of the oral legends,
Yeah.
suggested that she was pregnant at the time when she died, although there's nothing in any of the texts that correlate with that.
Yeah.
Well, the information about her, that all comes from ancient Egypt, not from the later stories.
Mm-hmm.
So you get a picture that there's effigies of her as a child and as a woman. In fact, the cover of the book shows like the best representation of what she may have looked like. And in some of the inscriptions of her in a chariot and with her sisters, with her mother, um, praying to the art and such like that, you have information. She's mentioned in various letters, and there's various inscriptions where she's praised by her father, etc., all written in hieroglyphs. Of course, none of this was available until after the finding of the Rosetta Stone, which famously enabled, because I think it was in three languages. I think was it in, uh, I think in hieroglyphs in, I think Demotic, and possibly was it ancient Greek or Latin? I forget which the three languages were, but from that one stone, they were then able to like
Mm-hmm.
translate a huge amount of the hieroglyphs
Yeah.
and understand how the hieroglyph system actually worked. And then, but prior to that, if you've seen a huge wall full of hieroglyphs, which has got this enormous
Yeah.
message or story on it, you wouldn't have no idea what it actually meant, because
Okay.
it took that before people could actually translate most of the stuff. The other
Yeah.
source, of course, the Sumerian script, the cuneiform. You've got documents written in that, which was the international language of the time.
Okay. And so what challenges did you face then when you were trying to reconstruct a plausible journey for Meritaten across thousands of miles from Spain to Scotland to Ireland? Because if you're saying that there's not much information after she leaves, then how did you piece together that story?
Well, that was a real challenge, and that was the thing I was most worried about. And the biggest challenge, well, the two things was one, I thought, God, uh, Egypt, oh, that's really asking for trouble because everyone's got an opinion on Egypt. The historians, archaeologists will be, if I get my information wrong, then I'm going to be like assassinated, like on the internet. I'm just going to get so slagged for wrong information. So I thought, right, I got to get all the stuff really carefully done. And so I really, really put a lot of time and effort into getting that end of it right. And then I thought, right, Spain, that's going to be a tough one. I did get a bit of help there. There's a couple of professors that gave me a few bits of information and some of their books, and I managed to use Google Translate and whatever to read articles too. And there's an author in Scotland called 𝗵𝗵𝗶𝘀. She's actually Spanish. She was helpful as well, gave me some good pointers. So if it wasn't for the help of other people, I think I would have really struggled with the whole Spanish section. Um, so that once you're pointed in the direction that you need to go, and you've got various sources to look at, I can do research, I can analyze information, but when you don't know where to start, really, because if you try and do an internet search on Scotia in Spain, you're not going to find that much actually. And certainly in English, you won't find a whole lot. So that took a lot of work, a lot of digging, and that section I think took me a lot longer, a lot more effort than um, you know the sections on Scotland and Ireland, because I'm much more in familiar territory there, and I already had I had most of the textbooks that I needed already. I think it was only the Scottish books that I had to buy, because I really don't like reading PDFs and such like. If I It's just a pain. For a short article, I can do that, but if I go like 𝗰𝗵𝗶𝘀 𝗁𝗃𝗃 is bloody huge. Okay, there's only a small section of it you actually need to read, but uh, it's no fun going through a PDF which is in a really old font anyway. I find that
Yeah,
bit makes your headache after a little while. So, um, but the point is, like, I had a lot of most of the books that were relevant. I already had them anyway. I got for other reasons, not connected with Scotia or Scota. So I thought, well, I the last thing I wanted is to write this book and then everyone just pull it to bits and go, right, that's rubbish, blah blah blah. So I really tried to lift every stone I could and look underneath it and try and find real stuff that was relevant. Because I mean, there's a lot of stuff that I could have included, which is maybe tenuous connection or
yeah,
really relevant. And I just thought, right, I'm going to be really ruthless about it. If it's not relevant, if it doesn't reinforce the story, leave it out. And then I thought, if I find anything that contradicts what I'm looking at, I need to actually put that in because obviously, if there's evidence that actually that contradicts what I'm saying, then you have to look at that as well.
yeah,
So
of course.
I didn't actually find anything that would lead me to believe that this whole story is false.
Oh,
I think that's important, just as important as your theory. You need to look at things that might go in the opposite direction. Otherwise, you're not being impartial in any
yeah.
way.
So, maybe you can help me clear up a little bit of confusion. It's been a long time since I've looked at the 𝗺𝗵𝗶𝘀, and I may be wrong about this, but on my reading, it seems that there was two Scotas. There's the
There's three
mother.
versions of the story in that volume. The way it's presented, it's like chopped up. It's quite hard. I hate the way it's presented, but you've got three different redactions of the.
Okay.
So it's they're not completely in agreement with each other.
Hmm. Yeah, and that was part of the question I wanted to ask, because it seems like there's at least two distinct Scotias that are living at different times in history. So the first Scotia is, if I can remember this correctly, is they're both of them are daughters of pharaohs, and the first Scotia was from the Amarna period, which was like 1350 BCE. But the second Scotia was the wife of 𝗵𝗵𝗶𝘀. And so the first Scotia, she was the mother of 𝗺𝗲𝗺𝗀𝗀, and her story is connected with the origins of Gaelic, the Irish language.
Mm.
The second Scotia is the wife of 𝗵𝗵𝗶𝘀, and she's also connected to Egypt, but then her story is happening around 350 BC, I think, or I'm not too sure of the years. And I'm wondering if that's something that you were aware of in your research, and if so, how did you bridge that gap?
Well, I think there's a bit of confusion, probably down to the um, sort of rewriting of the Egyptian list of kings. I think may have something to do with that. So when you look at the Greek and versions, all the names don't really correspond with the Egyptian, and certainly not with the English names now. So I mean, we obviously back in the day that people wouldn't have been using English when these early accounts, it didn't even exist as a language back then. So I think what's happened has just been a kind of conflation of different versions, especially like the confusion over Ramesses II and Moses' connection there. Obviously, people love to have a connection to the Bible if they could. It gave things sort of legitimacy if you could tie in. I mean, there's a lot of that in the ancient books, the 𝗺𝗺𝗺𝗺 and all that kind of thing that you'll find in references to Irish history. You've even got I think there was a bunch of crazy sort of British sort of I don't know what you call them, Israelites or Israelite fans that came over to Tara looking for
Yeah,
Ark of the
I
Covenant.
actually I
Just
actually
oh
wrote an
my God,
article about that
yeah,
just a few weeks ago. If anybody's interested, it's called Raiders of the Lost Ark, and
yeah,
it's on my blog. Um, and I was very surprised when I heard about that as well. Now, I just want to be clear, they weren't Israelis because Israel didn't exist yet. It was 1989 to 1902. They're British Israelites, and clearly don't have respect for our traditions and our heritage.
oh,
They came over and they started putting dynamite into the hill of Tara and blowing up holes because they were convinced, and that incidentally was also based on Freemasonic writings, but that's another story. And they were convinced that the Ark of the Covenant was hidden in the hill of Tara, which they say is the hill of Torah, the hill of the Torah. So they didn't find it anyway, but yeah, that didn't stop them looking.
yeah. Well, you got an interesting thing with language. That sometimes people equate two words, like Torah obviously comes from Hebrew, and Tara is obviously the anglicization of the Irish name, which is of course not spelled Tara. Uh, yeah,
It's 𝗃𝗵𝗵𝗀𝗃,
yeah,
which
exactly, yeah,
in the earlier time when we had the dots, it would be TEAM
yeah.
dot
So to get the
AIR.
equivalency between the word Torah in English and the word Tara in English, oh,
Tower.
it's only out by one vowel. Like that means absolutely nothing. And people are often convinced by these spurious arguments about, oh, in this language it's this, in this language and that. And like for a start, you got two different alphabets. Like the Irish weren't using the English alphabet, they would have been using Ogham script or a different version of a Latin script, which only changed the modern Roman script in like 1960, I think, where we actually
Yeah,
adopted the
exactly.
full on, European form of the alphabet.
And I
Before that,
believe
it was
that
different.
coincides with the time when typewriters came out.
Yeah, and look at, you look at Hebrew, that's not even close to Roman script in any way. So you're talking about two completely unrelated languages.
Yeah,
And then you're then transposing them into English and then going, oh, look at this, these two words almost the same. It's just like, what a load of nonsense. And to then somehow conclude because these two words look similar, that the Ark of the Covenant must be buried underneath the hill of Tara. Are
yeah.
you really clutching at straws? And
Well,
people are connecting dots and
yeah.
it's like adding two and two and getting 57, you know?
There's also a story that Jacob's pillar became the 𝗃𝗏,
Yeah.
which is the stone of destiny, which was on the hill of Tara. It's not the stone
I
that's there
mentioned that in the
today.
book,
It's
but
it's
I
another
didn't want
stone.
to. I didn't want to really delve too much into some of the really way out there ideas. I mean, I was aware I didn't mention about the Ark and the Covenant, and I didn't really go into Jacob's pillow either. I do go for the whole story about the stone of Scone coming from Ireland, and I do believe the current 𝗃𝗏 is not the original one. I,
I agree with you. I think that it's held in Scotland by a
yeah.
group of Templars.
But I'm trying to stay away from this whole like total conspiracy theory stuff because the minute you go there, your credibility is just completely undermined. So I think they that stone that's there in Tara now probably is a sacred stone of some kind, and they just got put there because the original 𝗃𝗏 got taken to Scotland. And if you look at the coronation stones for each of the provinces, they were all oblong or square. So why would this
Yes,
one stone be shaped like I don't know what you'd call it? It's almost phallic, isn't it?
exactly. It's a phallic symbol.
Yeah,
Um,
it doesn't
yeah,
make
I
any
agree with
sense.
you. I agree with you, but I think the fact that we're speaking about it now, it suggests to me that there's definitely enough information to do a study on it, and maybe that could be your next book. I don't know. Um, uh,
Well, I don't I do go into a bit of detail about it, but I really don't think I wouldn't say there's really a whole book on the 𝗃𝗏 there really, because it's really interesting. I used to live in a village called Monaseed up in Wexford, and about 2 or 3 kilometers away is the site of where a Leinster coronation stone was kept.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, there's nothing there. It's just a field. There's all been ploughed over so much that whatever there may have been there in terms of a ruin is completely gone. So what happened to that coronation stone, nobody knows. They don't know where it went. I think when the Normans first came here, that still existed, that site, and the stone still existed. God knows what happened to that. It's just
Yeah,
gone. And like so many things that have just gone. So I don't think we'd ever really know for sure. Um, I think we wouldn't find any definitive proof of where the 𝗃𝗏𝗏 came from. I mean, you've got a confusion there in the histories where some people suggest that Scotia brought it, but then you've got this older story of the 𝗃𝗏𝗏𝗀 bringing it, well, one of their 4 treasures. And I'd be inclined to think that is probably the origin of that stone. That
okay.
why would they make it up? They're going to bring these 4 items with them. Oh no, we're just going to lie and say we brought this, a cauldron, a spear, and a sword and a stone with us. We're just going to
Mhm.
make up this thing. Uh, I I don't think these are all entirely fictitious. I think
Yeah,
these things are like either uh, historical fact or there's some kind of allegorical story. And something like that, a stone that's like that big, it's not really that huge, is actually easily transportable on a ship,
yeah,
So why would you just make this stuff up? I think they when the 𝗃𝗏𝗏𝗀 did come here, they probably brought these items with them, and that's why there's so many stories about them. And it's even recorded about the cities that they came from and who brought them, even though we don't actually know where that island apparently where they came from. We don't know where that is. It could be Gotland, it could be somewhere over. Speculations about Scythia as somewhere where the 𝗃𝗏𝗏𝗀 came from.
yeah. Well,
It's not actually specified, so nobody actually knows for sure, you
if
know.
if if we were having this conversation 20 or 30 years ago, um, it'd be, what am I trying to say? There's been a lot of genetic research
Mm,
which backs up or validates theories that would have been considered conspiracy or speculation before we had the science to do that.
mm,
So what I'm talking about here is the genetics of Tutankhamun, which is haplogroup 𝗵𝗵𝗀𝗀𝗄69. How does this how do you work that into the book, first of all? Because I think that's really fascinating evidence. And how do
mm.
you explain to skeptics who might argue that the 𝗵𝗵𝗃269 haplogroup could stem from other migrations and not necessarily an Egyptian one?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting point. That you're right in that group itself could have much earlier origins. Certainly, I think I forget, is it Thutmose the second, possibly is the earliest recorded instance of that in ancient Egypt. Then that could have come from a different place again, because that is found somewhere else further into Asia, I think. But we don't know if you had multiple access points into, say, Europe. It could have come exclusively through Egypt, or it could have come through some other group as well. And that's the thing they don't know.
Yes.
But what we do know is there's a definite link between the the Egyptian elite class, if you like, uh, and Europe. And it's all across Western Europe, but it's much stronger in Britain and Ireland and that little piece of northern West Spain.
Yeah, exactly. And that's
So
the reason
we,
why I was asking this, because we have legends that talk about the Milesians coming from Spain, okay? And without the evidence to back it up, it's just speculation, right? And I'm sure a lot of people over the years were kind of mocked, or, the Chinese whispers thing we were talking about earlier. it's like you would be forgiven for thinking that somebody is crazy for suggesting that, oh, we originated in Spain. But when you factor in this story that you're after writing Scotia, and with the scientific evidence to back up that theory, it just adds a whole other perspective on it. It just adds a whole other insight into the fact that this story may not be a story after all.
Yeah, well, that's my whole contention. And at the end of the book, and even at the beginning and the end of my introduction, I'd say, well, this is the basic premise, and it is as yet not definitively proven, but that's what I would hope we'll eventually get one day to the point where there will be an attempt to find the actual completely definitive evidence, which would obviously be through DNA. That would be the ultimate way of proving a story to be correct. If you found ancient bodies in Ireland and you did a genetic comparison with any of the Egyptian royal family and you found a direct link,
Yeah.
then that would
Mhm.
prove not that at least somebody came here who was connected to the pharaonic Egyptians.
Yeah. Hmm.
So I'd be delighted if that happened. And look, if it does turn out that I'm wrong and they found a body there and it was, I don't know, related to people from Austria, say, for sake of argument, then that would show that, I'm wrong. But I would love to know, regardless of whether my own theory is right, I would love to know the answer to this. Is there anyone buried there? And if so, where did they come from? And what time period
Yeah.
were they buried? Because there's two things there. There's the time period, you can get that from carbon dating, and then there's the DNA analysis of the corpse. And those two things together could actually prove that the story is actually genuine and not just a load of old codswallop written down by scribes in a monastery somewhere who
Yeah.
thought, oh, well, I'm going to elaborate this a little bit more than
Hmm.
previously elaborated on.
And we didn't even go into that topic of the monks were the ones writing this down. And there's a theory that suggests that the monks, they wanted to, give the Irish race a special place in history. So they reinvented and reimagined some of the stories in the Bible. So I believe that there's an Irish person at the birth of Christ. There was Irish people on the Tower of Babel. Um, and that's where the 𝗁𝗲𝗄 thing comes in, because he was the person on the Tower of Babel who was given the Irish language. And that's the connection to Scotia again, like the first Scotia. Um,
Well, interestingly, there the Scholar's Primer is another prime example. Sorry, I didn't mean to make a pun there, but of that connection where you've got oh, was it Phineas or I forget the name.
Phineas, yeah, but I
I
can't
think
remember his surname
it's
either.
linked through the Tower of Babel, the language, the origins of 𝗰, the origins of the Irish languages, all goes back to the Tower of Babel, the Tower of Ninnius, I think it's described as in that, or Nimrod's Tower. Sorry, Nimrod's
Yeah,
Tower.
I
But
think
that,
that the person you're talking about,
that's a
Neil.
little bit later that book than the book of the Taking of Ireland, but
Yeah,
it's still like I think is that 11th century? I think 10th or 11th century that book.
yeah.
And
I think
but
I
the
think the
origins of
name you're
that are
looking
even
for.
older because you've got bits of old Irish in that, which have
Yeah,
been put into the later version. So the actual original content, who knows how old that is?
yeah. Okay. So what was the surprising discovery about history, genetics, or yourself that emerged during your research, and how did it influence the final product of Scotia?
Well, I think the thing that really struck me was like that obviously no one else has seen these markings on the grave that I observed. But that would make sense because if it's just a bit damp or a bit misty or it's dry, you don't really see them. And I've been there, quite a few times. And at one particular time, it was a deluge of rain, and that's why I took the photographs. And then I'm just like, oh. Oh, I didn't see this before. Oh, that's interesting. And I just took the photographs and I thought, oh, I bet we'll have a look at that sometime. And then it just kind of got, thank God I didn't actually throw them away. It took me a while to find them again, actually. I've got a little hard drive with all my photographs on it, and I couldn't remember where they were, but they were there, thank goodness. So I managed to retrieve all the photographs. But it just struck me as like an odd thing. And I suppose that cemented the idea. When I looked into it, I borrowed a book of a dictionary of hieroglyphs, and then you're just like, painfully going through all these. There's like, I think around that time there was just over 1,000 hieroglyphs, and then later on in a later period you got like, I don't know, something like 2 or 3 thousand hieroglyphs. But obviously I had to restrict myself to that time period that we're looking at. But even trying to look through a list of 1,000 hieroglyphs is really painful. And because the book actually are not very big, the way they're printed, they're quite small. I actually scanned them out of the book and blew them up to a decent size, but they're quite teeny weeny in the book, and it's quite tough going. But yeah, I actually found that two of the symbols or engravings or whatever you wanted to call it actually do match very well.
And Luke, how would you address historians who view your theory as too speculative, or what do you think the best counter arguments would be for making this story more compelling for your historians who might be skeptical of your findings?
Well, I suppose, they're entitled to try and pull my argument apart. Well, I didn't put footnotes in, which I'll probably get a slagging for, but this isn't really meant to be an academic book. It's not, I'm not like doing a thesis for a PhD or something. This is actually supposed to be a commercial book for a mainstream audience. I'm not trying to write for academics, but at the same time, all the sources I've used are verifiable, respected papers and articles and books. A lot of them are academic books I've used as a source material. So I'd hope that they would look at the bibliography and realize that I haven't just plucked this all out of thin air, that I've put a lot of time and effort into researching this. But obviously, I would say, well, you're entitled to your opinion, because you look at any time period you want to pick, you get two different historians and they disagree. And if you get into the field of archaeology, oh my, you get some real ding dongs there of like people arguing the toss over how to interpret information. Because I mean, in any sphere of life, you can take a subject and present it and ask for an opinion. You'll get 15 different opinions, and like,
Yeah.
it's a really difficult one, really, because if there was a definitive view on everything, then there wouldn't be any need for anybody to write any books. There'd just be the one book which had all the answers to everything on that particular subject, and that would be it. That would be the one and only version that you'd ever need. But of course, with all things to do with humans, it's not as simple as, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and this happened in that order. And there's so many different factors into not just what happened, but why things happened too. Reading this book on ancient Rome, I was quite shocked to see the parallels between the modern day and that time. And you're talking like sort of late days of the Republic, early Empire period,
Yeah.
And you've got sort of things like people going out and borrowing money because they want to have a big, massive, huge party in their gaff to celebrate whatever, their daughter or son's birthday, or they got like a promoted to the Senate or whatever. And they go out and shopping for lavish furniture and get themselves up to their oxters in debt. And I thought, this sounds like 2007 in this country. Oh, we're going to hire a chef, and we just bought this massive BMW Jeep, and these are people getting themselves in. I thought it's just like modern life. These people, their lives were probably very similar. Their concerns were probably very similar, going back into the ancient world. So I think when you look at history, I think there's often a temptation to see them as somehow very different and very separate.
Yeah.
And,
Hmm.
people had families, they had friends, they had jobs, they sometimes had to go to war, but then you got huge, long periods of peace as well at times. So,
Yeah.
I think human nature is basically still the
Yeah,
same.
I
I think,
agree. I don't think human nature changes that quickly, you know what I mean? So I would suggest that the way we are today, for the most part, okay, we have better technology, fine, but the way we think, the way we act, the relationships that we form, the way we fall out with each other is going to be pretty much identical to the last like several thousand years of human history.
yeah. So I think I try to look at history in that context of, you know, um, obviously I want to be as accurate as I possibly can, where, there are indisputable facts, they need to be obviously remembered and brought forward. But I think there's a lot of what goes on where trying to put a context on it can be quite complicated,
Yeah.
because human
Hmm.
life is complicated. Even stuff that's happening today or even this week,
Yeah,
you know, well, don't even get me started. Well, how people are going to interpret that or explain what is
exactly.
going on or
Yeah,
why it's happening.
exactly. So what's your next book topic going to be? And would you like to talk about the previous titles that you've already published?
Okay, well, the next thing I'm working on, well, I've kind of got two books really, which probably the next one's going to be like a book on sacred sites, which will be sort of a combination of photography and a narrative. So that's like a long-term project which has been stalled at various points. So I think I'd like to do that one next. I probably will write another book on Druidism in will probably be my last word on the subject because there's only so much you can say on that really. Um, but yeah, those are sort of another two things I'd like to sort of get done in the next few years. Um, but yeah, previous stuff I've written about Druids already. I've got a book called the Druid's Primer, which is sort of like a sort of compendium of all the information that I've sort of built up, or not all of it, but like, sort of a concise version of what my library consists of, plus what I've learned from other people and my own experiences. And the Druid Garden sort of combines my horticultural, agricultural, and Druidic sort of interest into one thing. I suppose I've written about general spirituality, which is called The Journey, and then I've written a little environmental book called How to Save the Planet. Um, and then there's a few other things as well. But I don't really stick to any particular theme. I'm not one for getting like I'm going to do a book on frogs and then I'll do another eight
Mhm.
books on frogs.
Pigeonholed, we call that.
Yeah, I've no interest in doing that, and that's one
Yeah.
reason why I'm not going to do a whole load more Druid books because if I do another one, it's going to be the last one, and that'll be it.
Yeah, I'm just looking at your website here, and it looks like you have 3 books about Druidry because you also have a path through the forest.
Yeah, that was fairly recent. That's essays and interviews, mostly essays.
Yeah,
Uh,
and you
co-
also have a book on the roots of Halloween called Samhain,
oh yeah, yeah, I forgot
and
about
you have 2 books of folktales, Dingle folktales
that.
and Kerry folktales.
Yeah, that was really challenging for me actually because it's different from writing essays because I've written like long but fairly long books, and then the challenge of actually writing stories and some of it's historic. Some of them are just like reinterpretations and updates of old myths and old stories. I found quite a lot of old folk tales written in Victorian English and whatever, um, which are quite indigestible. And then bits from the Duke of Schools collection, which are all some of them a bit gobbledygook, but you've got like the bones of a good story there.
Yeah.
And then there's sort of actual historical elements to that. So I suppose, yeah, going and looking at the history and trying to write a short piece of like a few pages, that's quite a skill in itself, very different from writing long form. And of course, if you're writing an article, some of it might be opinion based, whereas like when you're writing something mythological or to do with folklore, you're not going to put an opinion, or at least you shouldn't do, in my opinion. You should just stick to the story and try. I've really tried not to embellish the stories. So when I got an old story, say, about like Killarney Lakes or whatever, I tried to like just update the English and make it easier to read and not actually rewrite the story as such. So, the actual course of events and the characters all the way through follows the original, but I've just rewritten it into so it's not in oldie worldy, horrible to read prose. And
Excellent.
that was a hard job, both
Yeah.
on Kerry folk tales, and then I suppose by the time I did Dingle folk tales, I'd gotten more practice at it, so it wasn't as hard to do it again. But that was a
So
challenge. But I need a challenge. I don't want to do this over and over. And I just like, if I end up bored with my own,
variety is the spice of life.
yeah, if I'm not interested in what I'm writing about it, right, about how could I expect anyone else to be interested?
Yeah,
So I'm
absolutely.
always looking for something that's fresh that will captivate my attention. And then when I'm really into what I'm writing about, then I think I do a good job. Whereas if I don't care, it's going to be very, at best, mediocre. And
Yeah.
I don't want to produce something that I consider to be mediocre. What's the
And
point in that? It's like the world's not short of books or authors these days, is it? So
no,
why bother producing something that's just
if
okay?
it's difficult to write, it's going to be difficult to read. So I really appreciate that you're enjoying your work and you're trying to put a bit of your own energy into it, because I find that very important. So the last question I have, or maybe second last question, is where can people buy a copy of Scotia, the Lost Sister of Tutankhamun?
Well, there's a few places. If you buy it at my website, then you get a signed copy, and that might not appeal to everyone because if you're in Australia or Canada or the USA, for instance, the post cost's going to be a lot. But you can get all those on the more local sites like Barnes and Noble. I think in the States is the cheapest place, and then I think Amazon covers Canada, America, all of Europe, Australia, etc., New
Yeah.
Zealand. Yeah.
So if they want a signed copy, they should go to your site, which is lukeeastwood.com, and that's Luke Eastwood with two E's, right? Um, and they can get it directly from you. I think that's the preferred option. Because
Yeah, well, I suppose that is
there's no
if you're
like
in
there's
Ireland,
no handling fees or anything like that if they go directly to you.
just the postage fee, which in Ireland is 2.95, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Okay.
it's reasonable.
Yeah.
Whereas,
No, I'm going to put these links in the description of this video. So if you're interested, just look in the description box and you're
or
going
you
to
can
be
get
able to
the
find
ebook
out
as
links.
well as ebook versions too, which are cheaper. Obviously, you've got Kindle or whatever that
Hmm.
might appeal to some people. Personally, I don't like reading the electronic format, so I always buy a real have in
Yeah.
my hand always. I just find it too hard work trying to read.
And if they buy the electronic version off your website, it's not going to be signed, is it?
No, but it will be in color though.
Okay.
So
That's
the
that's a good tip.
photographs are black and white in the actual paperback, but
Oh, I
they're,
see.
they're in
Okay,
color
okay.
on the electronic version. Because
Oh, that's
obviously there's
interesting.
no
Yeah.
difference in cost, obviously, to do it uh, on a digital version. You can do it in color and it costs nothing extra. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
printing the book with color photographs, you're getting into some serious overhead there, you know.
Yeah. Okay. So if you want to get the printed copy of the book that's signed, they can go to your website. For the electronic version, it doesn't really matter where they buy it as long as they can, like, they're going to get it immediately.
Mm.
And where's the best place for people to reach out to you and ask you questions, or like how can people get in touch with you? You mentioned you had a YouTube channel. Maybe you'd want to share
Yeah,
that.
I have a YouTube channel which is just Luke Eastwood, I think, or Luke Eastwood author. I forget actually what it's called. Um, and then I've got a Facebook which is Luke Eastwood author. So you can send messages from that, and actually my email address is on my website anyway. Mostly I like email because it's there and you can just like go and go through it at your own time. Whereas the phone really annoys me. It's pinging, pinging, and then half the time I'm like, I don't want to look at it. I'm just like, I really don't like social media that much. I know you have to use it. It's part of the modern world and part of communicating your message. But I would ideally prefer just to just go go and fiddle around in the garden or sit there reading a book or whatever, watching a DVD, and not have to deal with all this social media world.
Yeah.
But I'd be fooling myself if I thought you could just get away with not engaging with all that. It's just, I suppose it's brilliant at the same time. Like my you see, I've got Canada's T-shirt. My sister lives in Canada. That's where I got this. And like, thanks to modern technology, I can use Zoom or Messenger or WhatsApp or whatever to talk to her instead of having to like, when I was a kid, you picked up a phone off the wall and you
Yeah.
dialed thing, and it cost a fortune to ring someone in
Yeah.
the
And
country.
I'm not that old, but I'm old enough to remember those phones with the ring. I don't know what you'd call it.
Dial on it,
The
yeah.
dial-up phone.
Mm.
And then when we had the the buttons that you could actually press, it was a big leap forward, let's say.
Yeah.
And where we're at now, it's just like it's phenomenal. And then you look at like the AI and all of this sort of stuff. It's really like we're on the cusp of a technological revolution, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know whether we'll look back and say it was a good thing or a bad thing. I guess that remains to be seen.
Yeah. Well, I
Um,
mean, technology's always been there of some kind.
yeah,
It's just the way you use it. I like to be very much grounded in the real world as much as I can. But like, if you think about it, like when someone first invented a bowl made out of hot clay, it was someone go, oh, geez, that's a bit odd. I'm sure that'll never take off, you know? What would you want one of those for? There probably was somebody back then in like, prehistory saying, pottery, we don't need that. That's rubbish.
yeah, exactly, exactly. And look where we are now.
Yeah.
All right, so do you want to have the last word, Luke? Anything you want to say to
Well,
my
mostly I
audience?
just want to
Or
say thank you for having me, and it's been really
you're
interesting
welcome.
to discuss all these things and like you know, a little different perspective you've taken on it, which I found really interesting. And you know, it some of the questions aren't that easy to answer, but it's great that it's long enough an interview that I could actually go
Yeah,
into depth with it. Whereas if you're like doing a 15 minutes or something, you're not going to be able to go into any depth at all.
exactly.
So I appreciated having a long interview that we could actually discuss some of this in detail, you know.
Well, I'm glad that you got something out of it because I certainly learned a lot from speaking to you. And I'd just like to say thanks to you for your work and thanks for sending me the electronic version of the book. I got to go through it before the interview, and that's why the questions were so thoughtful, let's say.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, until we meet again or until we talk again, thanks so much, Luke, and I wish you all the best in your future endeavors.
Yeah, thanks a million for having me. It's been great. Thank you.